The pandemic had done strange things to my sense of time. Days bled into each other, classes went virtual, and the world outside seemed to hold its breath. Stuck in the monotony of it all, I'd taken to exploring places most people avoided. Abandoned houses, crumbling factories, and on rare occasions, parks with a reputation for the eerie. Camel's Back Park was one of those places. By day, it was a picturesque escape, full of joggers and families. But at night, it was something else entirely. I'd heard stories of strange happenings there. A shadowy figure near the trails, disembodied voices carried on the wind. The thrill of it was irresistible. Elena, though, was not so easily convinced. She was in my psychology class at the community college, sharp and practical in a way I admired. We'd started talking more since classes went online, and when I casually mentioned my late-night adventures, she laughed. "You're chasing ghosts," she said, shaking her head. But when I invited her to come with me to Camel's Back Park, she surprised me. "Fine," she said with a shrug, "but if this ends with us running from raccoons, I'm never letting you live it down." I liked her sense of humor, even if I knew it masked her nervousness. We arrived at the park just before 3 in the morning. The lot was empty, save for a single street lamp flickering weakly. The trailhead yawned open before us, a void carved into the trees. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that settled into your bones and made you second-guess yourself. I tried to sound casual as I turned to Elena. "Ready?" She glanced at the flashlight in her hand, and then at the trail. "This better not be one of those urban legend things where the boyfriend gets his girlfriend scared on purpose," she muttered, stepping in behind me. The darkness swallowed us whole. The trail was narrow, flanked by trees so dense they seemed to lean in, conspiring to block out the world. Elena's flashlight cast a narrow beam, illuminating little more than the dirt path ahead. I wished I'd brought my own light, but I didn't want to admit it now. The silence was unsettling, the kind that felt like a vacuum, like the forest itself was holding its breath. "It's just trees," I said, my voice breaking the stillness. Elena didn't respond, her focus fixed straight ahead. We walked for what felt like forever, though it couldn't have been more than 10 minutes. That's when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound, faint and distant. At first I thought it might have been the wind playing tricks on me, but no, it was too deliberate. A melody, clear and haunting, floated through the air like it had no source. I stopped in my tracks. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Elena froze beside me, her eyes darting into the darkness. "It's probably just someone with a speaker," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. We pressed on, but the melody followed. It was soft at first, then louder, as though it were weaving through the trees, circling us. "Okay, that's creepy," Elena said finally, gripping my arm. I tried to brush it off to tell her it was just some weirdo playing a prank, but the truth was my skin was crawling. Whatever was making that sound, it wasn't just random noise. It was deliberate, steady, and worst of all, it was everywhere at once. We ventured deeper into the trail, each step drawing us further from the faint safety of the street lamp's glow. The melody surrounded us, soft but unrelenting, as though the trees themselves were humming. My nerves were fraying, but I kept my voice steady. "It's just someone messing around," I said, not sure if I was trying to convince Elena or myself. She didn't answer, her flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. The beam danced across the trail, illuminating twisted branches and patches of dead leaves. But there was no sign of another person. The farther we went, the heavier the air seemed to grow. It was the kind of silence that wasn't really silent at all. The faint creak of tree limbs shifting in the breeze, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and that unshakable melody, steady as a heartbeat. "You really think someone's out here, in the middle of the night, playing the flute?" Elena whispered. I shrugged, keeping my eyes ahead. "Maybe," I said, "or maybe it's just the wind." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were a lie. Then we heard it, a rustling sound, soft but deliberate, coming from the underbrush to our left. Both of us froze, and Elena aimed her flashlight in the direction of the noise. The beam illuminated only dense foliage, but the sound persisted, a faint shuffle, as though something or someone was moving just out of sight. "Probably an animal," I said, though my voice cracked on the last word. Elena looked at me, her expression a mix of fear and disbelief. "An animal that plays the flute?" She shot back. Before I could answer, the rustling stopped, and something darted across the trail ahead of us. It was fast, so fast that I couldn't make out its shape. Elena gasped, and I felt my stomach drop. I stepped forward, squinting into the darkness, but the trail ahead was empty. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my heart pounding. "Yeah," I said, "but I don't know what it was." The flute melody continued, unchanged, as if mocking our confusion. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, straining to see into the blackness. The flashlight's beam seemed woefully inadequate, swallowed by the shadows. I reached for Elena's hand, partly to reassure her, but mostly to ground myself. "Let's keep moving," I said, my voice low. She hesitated but nodded, and we started walking again, faster this time. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The flute grew louder as we walked, its melody still rhythmic but somehow sharper, more insistent. The rustling returned, this time on both sides of the trail. It wasn't constant, but it was close enough to set my nerves on edge. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the path ahead, but every sound made my pulse quicken. Elena squeezed my hand, her grip tighter than before. "This isn't funny anymore," she said, her voice shaking. "I know," I replied, though I had no idea how to make it stop. The melody, the rustling, the oppressive darkness, it all felt like it was closing in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was watching us. The moment we reached a narrow bend in the trail, the rustling sounds became impossible to ignore. They were louder now, purposeful, as if something was circling us, staying just out of sight. I stopped and turned in a slow circle, scanning the darkness with my eyes, but there was nothing. Elena's flashlight flickered as her shaking hand betrayed her growing panic. "Who's there?" I shouted into the void, trying to sound braver than I felt. My voice echoed back, mocking in its futility. The rustling stopped for a moment, replaced by a suffocating silence. Then the flute began again, louder and sharper, each note digging into my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. The melody twisted, no longer rhythmic but erratic, a discordant series of high-pitched wails. Elena grabbed my arm. "We have to go," she said, her voice trembling. I nodded, but my feet felt glued to the ground. For a moment I thought I saw something, a shadow flitting between the trees, impossibly fast, and too tall to be human. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like my chest might burst. We started walking again, this time at a near jog, our breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The trail seemed narrower than before, the trees pressing in closer. I couldn't tell if we were heading deeper into the park or back toward the entrance. My sense of direction was gone, replaced by an overwhelming need to get away. The rustling came again, this time directly behind us, and I heard Elena choke back a sob. "Keep moving," I said, though my voice sounded distant, even to me. As we turned another bend, the sound of the flute shifted. It wasn't just louder, it was everywhere, surrounding us in an oppressive wall of sound. I gritted my teeth, willing myself to focus, but my mind was racing with every terrifying possibility. Was it an animal? A person? Something else entirely? Elena stumbled and I caught her arm, steadying her. "We're almost there," I lied, though I had no idea where there even was. The rustling came again, louder now, and closer than it had ever been. Elena screamed, a sharp, desperate sound that cut through the flute's relentless melody. I spun around, searching for the source of the noise, and that's when I saw it, just for a second. A shadow, darker than the surrounding night, darted across the trail, impossibly fast. It didn't look human. It didn't look like anything I could explain. My stomach dropped, and for a moment, I couldn't move. "Run!" Elena yelled, breaking me out of my trance. We bolted, sprinting down the trail as fast as our legs could carry us. Branches clawed at my face and arms, the cold air burning my lungs, but I didn't stop. The flute's melody followed us, relentless, its notes twisting and rising until they became a shriek. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see, or worse, what I wouldn't. Elena was ahead of me now, her flashlight swinging wildly as she ran. All I could think about was reaching the end of the trail, escaping the darkness, and leaving whatever was out there behind us. The parking lot appeared ahead like an island in the middle of a raging storm. That faint street lamp, flickering and weak, was now the most comforting sight I had ever seen. Elena reached the car first, fumbling with the door handle before yanking it open and collapsing into the passenger seat. I was right behind her, practically throwing myself into the driver's seat and slamming the door shut. For a moment, neither of us moved, our ragged breathing the only sound in the suffocating silence. And then the flute stopped. It didn't fade or trail off. It simply ceased, as though cut by an invisible hand. The abrupt silence was almost as terrifying as the melody itself. I turned the key in the ignition with trembling fingers, the engine's low rumble grounding me just enough to feel like we were safe. At least for now. "What the hell was that?" Elena whispered, her voice shaky and barely audible. I didn't answer because I didn't know. All I could do was grip the steering wheel and pull out of the lot, my eyes flicking constantly between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. We didn't talk as I drove. The streets of Boise were empty, the city still asleep in the early hours of the morning. The darkened windows and silent houses should have been comforting, a return to normalcy, but they only reminded me of how exposed we had been back in the park. Every shadow on the side of the road made my pulse spike, and every whisper of wind against the car felt like a threat. Elena sat rigidly beside me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wasn't crying, but her red-rimmed eyes showed she was close. When we finally reached my apartment, I parked the car and killed the engine, but neither of us made a move to get out. "Do you think it was an animal?" she asked, after a long pause, her voice trembling with the effort to sound rational. I shook my head. "No," I said, my throat dry. "It wasn't an animal." I wanted to add more, to try to explain what we had seen, or rather what we hadn't seen, but my mind couldn't make sense of it. Every explanation felt inadequate, and the truth, whatever it was, seemed too big and too terrifying to face. We eventually made our way inside, the soft hum of the apartment building's fluorescent lights, a strange kind of comfort. I poured us both glasses of water, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the pitcher. Elena sipped hers in silence, her gaze fixed on some invisible point on the floor. "Do you think it was a person?" she asked finally, breaking the heavy quiet. I hesitated, then shook my head again. "I don't know," I admitted. "But if it was, they weren't normal." I didn't say what we were both thinking, that whatever had chased us wasn't human. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Elena stayed on the couch, too afraid to drive home, and I sat in the armchair across from her, neither of us willing to turn off the lights. I kept replaying the events in my head, trying to piece them together, but the memory of the flute's melody and that shadow darting across the trail refused to settle into anything coherent. When morning finally came, bringing with it the pale light of dawn, I felt more exhausted than relieved. Camel's Back Park had left its mark on us, and I knew that whatever we had encountered that night would haunt me for a long time. Even now, I can't pass by Camel's Back Park without feeling a chill run down my spine. I've told the story to a few close friends, but most of them laugh it off, saying it was probably some prank or a stray animal. I let them think that because the truth, whatever it is, feels too unsettling to share. I still hear the flute sometimes, in dreams, in the quiet moments when I'm alone. And every time I wonder what might have happened if we hadn't run.